Could you still make this room feel funk if I took everything away? Johnny Carson's question landed differently than he expected. The laughter inside NBC Studio One faded almost at once. James Brown sat across from him beneath the warm Tonight Show lights, one leg crossed, his gold-patterned jacket catching the glow from the cameras. A moment earlier, he had been smiling. Now, he was perfectly still. Carson leaned forward behind his desk. His expression was curious, not cruel, but the challenge was unmistakable. No horn section, Johnny continued. No dancers, no cape, no rehearsed arrangement, just you. The studio orchestra stopped moving. A musician lowered his instrument. Near the curtain, the floor manager stared at the countdown clock as though the entire broadcast had suddenly slipped beyond his control. James looked toward the audience, then back at Carson. "You think the show makes the music?" he asked quietly. Carson hesitated. "I'm asking whether the music survives without the show." For 3 long seconds, James Brown said nothing. Then his right hand moved toward the inside pocket of his jacket. The audience could not see what he touched there. Johnny could. It was an old envelope creased at the corners, softened by years, and carried close enough to James's heart that Carson immediately stopped smiling. The red camera light blinked on. They were live again. Johnny turned toward the audience, trying to recover the easy rhythm of the program. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe Mr. Brown has just accepted a challenge." Applause rose around them. James did not stand. "That depends," he said. "On what?" Carson asked. James slowly removed his hand from the envelope. "Whether you want me to entertain them." He looked past Johnny, toward 300 waiting faces. "Or tell them the truth." The applause died, because what James Brown was about to perform had never been rehearsed, never been written into the show, and before it was over, Johnny Carson would learn why that envelope had remained unopened for nearly 20 years. The challenge had not begun beneath the bright lights of The Tonight Show. It had started nearly 3 hours earlier, long before the audience filled the studio and long before Johnny Carson asked the question that would change the entire evening. NBC Studios in Burbank carried its usual rhythm that afternoon. Cameramen rolled heavy pedestal cameras across polished concrete floors. Stage managers walked quickly between dressing rooms with clipboards tucked beneath their arms. The Tonight Show orchestra drifted through warm-up scales while makeup artists hurried from one guest to another. Outside, audience members waited patiently with paper tickets in their hands, excited to watch America's most famous late-night host interview the legendary James Brown. Inside Dressing Room 6, however, the atmosphere was completely different. James Brown had arrived nearly an hour before anyone expected him. He always preferred extra time, not because he was nervous, but because he believed preparation was another form of respect. His musicians often joked that James could hear mistakes before anyone played the first note. Every entrance, every pause, every step onto a stage had meaning. To millions of fans, he was the hardest working man in show business. They saw the dazzling footwork, the explosive energy, the sweat, the screams, and the famous cape routine. But very few ever saw the quiet man who sat alone before every performance. James slowly opened his leather garment bag, carefully hanging his jacket before sitting beside a small wooden table. From the inside pocket of another coat, he removed an old cream-colored envelope whose edges had become soft with age. He stared at it for several seconds without opening it. His thumb gently traced the worn paper as though it carried something far more valuable than money or fame. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. "Mr. Brown," a young production assistant said politely, "Mr. Carson would like to meet you before rehearsal." James slipped the envelope back inside his jacket without answering immediately. As he stood, his eyes rested briefly on the mirror. The reflection looking back wasn't the energetic performer America thought it knew. It was a man carrying something he had never brought onto a television stage before. And before the evening was over, Johnny Carson would unknowingly force James Brown to open that envelope, for the first time in years. Johnny Carson had interviewed presidents, movie stars, heavyweight champions, comedians, and musicians from every corner of the entertainment world. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for asking the one question most people were careful to avoid. Not because he wanted to embarrass his guests, but because he believed that the real person usually appeared only after the prepared answers disappeared. James Brown intrigued him, not because of the records, not because of the fame, because Carson couldn't quite understand the man behind the performance. Nearly 40 minutes before the broadcast, the two finally met inside Carson's private office just off the studio hallway. A pot of fresh coffee sat between them while cue cards for the night's show were scattered across Carson's desk. The conversation began comfortably. Carson complimented Brown's incredible discipline. "I've watched your band," he said. "One look from you, and 20 musicians changed direction at exactly the same moment." James smiled politely. "They're not watching me," he replied. "They're listening." Carson nodded. "I've always admired that." For several minutes, they discussed touring, recording sessions, television audiences, and the pressure of performing night after night. Brown spoke with surprising calmness. He wasn't loud or theatrical. Every answer was measured. Every sentence carried purpose. Then Carson leaned back in his chair. "There is something I've wondered for years." James looked up. Carson continued carefully. "People call you the king of funk. They remember the dancing, the screaming, the cape routine, the incredible energy." He paused. "But sometimes I wonder." The room became unusually quiet. "Do they remember the music?" James's smile slowly disappeared. Carson didn't notice. "I mean," Carson continued, trying to explain himself, "your shows are incredible, but if all the spectacle disappeared, no choreography, no famous moves, no dramatic entrances, would people still feel the same thing?" Neither man spoke. Outside the office, someone pushed a lighting cart down the hallway. Its wheels echoed through the silence. James finally looked directly into Carson's eyes. "You think the show carries the music?" Carson answered honestly. "I think the show helps people hear it." Brown slowly shook his head. "No." His voice remained calm, but something inside it had changed. "The show only gets their attention." He leaned forward slightly. "The rhythm is what keeps them listening." Carson folded his hands. "Then maybe tonight," he said quietly, "you should prove me wrong." For several long seconds, James said absolutely nothing. Then he stood. Without another word, he reached inside his jacket and briefly touched the old envelope resting against his chest. A decision had just been made. James wasn't going to perform the song the producers had rehearsed. He wasn't going to give America the James Brown they expected. Tonight, Johnny Carson had unknowingly challenged something far deeper than funk. He had challenged the reason James Brown had created it in the first place. James Brown walked toward the center of the Tonight Show stage without saying another word. The audience expected the familiar explosion of energy. They expected the band to hit the opening notes of one of his biggest hits. They expected James to dance across the stage before the first lyric had even begun. Instead, nothing happened. He stood beneath a single spotlight with his hands resting at his sides. The orchestra looked toward him, waiting for the count-in they had rehearsed that afternoon. It never came. 5 long seconds passed. Inside a television studio, 5 seconds of silence felt almost dangerous. In the control room, one producer instinctively reached toward the talkback microphone. "Did something go wrong?" he whispered. Another producer shook his head. "No." His eyes never left the monitor. "He's waiting." On stage, Johnny Carson leaned back behind his desk, his confident expression slowly giving way to curiosity. Whatever James Brown was about to do, it clearly wasn't part of rehearsal. Then, tap. James gently struck the wooden stage with the heel of his shoe. The sound echoed through the studio. 1 beat, nothing else. A second later, tap, again. Still no music. The audience exchanged puzzled glances. James lowered his head and spoke so softly that the entire room leaned forward to hear him. Before I ever had a band, another tap. I had a floor. Silence. Before I ever had a microphone, tap. I had my own heartbeat. No one moved. Even the orchestra remained perfectly still. Johnny Carson slowly removed the interview cards from his hands and placed them on his desk. For the first time that night, he wasn't watching James Brown as a television guest. He was watching him as a storyteller. James looked toward the drummer. Without saying a word, he nodded once. Click. A single rim shot answered his heel. Nothing more. James smiled. That's where funk begins. Not with noise, not with horns, not with dancing. With listening. He tapped his heel again. Click, tap, click. A simple conversation between a shoe and a drum. The audience unconsciously began following the rhythm. A few people softly clapped along. James immediately raised one finger. No. The clapping stopped. He smiled kindly. Don't follow me. His eyes slowly swept across the room. Find the beat inside yourself. The silence returned. Then James reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Johnny Carson instantly recognized the old envelope. It was the same one James had touched earlier inside the dressing room. Brown unfolded the worn paper with extraordinary care, as though he feared time itself might tear it apart. He looked down at the faded handwriting before quietly reading aloud. When the room gets dark, count 4. He paused. When fear gets louder than hope, count 4. Another pause. Keep time, even when life doesn't. The words floated through Studio One like a prayer. No applause, no laughter, only silence. James carefully folded the paper again. My whole life, he said softly. People thought funk started when the band walked onto the stage. He slowly shook his head. It started long before that. He turned toward the orchestra. Tonight. Every musician straightened in their chair. Don't play what we rehearsed. The band leader frowned. What do you want us to play? James smiled. The way it sounded. He closed his eyes for just a moment. Before anybody believed we'd ever make it, the musicians looked at one another. No sheet music, no arrangement, no rehearsal. Johnny Carson realized, perhaps too late, that his challenge had become something far bigger than live television. James wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. He was about to reveal the memory hidden beneath every note he had ever played, and the first sound of that forgotten rhythm was just beginning to echo through the studio. James Brown slowly lifted his head. The drummer waited. The guitarist held his pick just above the strings. The horn section sat frozen, watching only one man. James didn't count them in. He simply breathed. The drummer caught it first. A soft kick drum answered the rhythm James had already created with his heel. The bass slipped quietly underneath it, followed by a single muted guitar scratch that barely filled the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It sounded unfinished, almost fragile. The audience looked confused. Many of them recognized the rhythm, but something was different. The song they expected had been stripped of everything familiar. There were no explosive horns, no dramatic introduction, no signature scream. James wanted them to hear the heartbeat before they heard the performance. Then he began to sing. His voice wasn't the roaring voice millions knew from arenas around the world. It was softer, older, more personal. Every word sounded less like a performance and more like a memory that had waited years to be spoken. Johnny Carson found himself leaning forward without realizing it. He wasn't listening for the next joke anymore. He was listening for the next truth. As the groove slowly grew, James never rushed it. Every instrument entered only after the one before it had found its place. The drummer followed James's foot. The bassist followed the drummer. The guitarist followed the bass. One by one, the musicians stopped reading their sheet music and began watching James himself. He wasn't conducting them with his hands, he was conducting them with his heartbeat. Then, just as the audience settled into the rhythm, James raised one finger. Instantly, the entire band stopped. Complete silence. Only James's foot continued tapping against the wooden stage. Tap, tap, tap. The beat never disappeared. It had simply moved somewhere the audience could no longer hear but could still feel. Several people unconsciously nodded their heads to a rhythm that no instrument was playing. Johnny Carson noticed it immediately. He looked around the studio and realized something extraordinary had happened. James Brown had removed the music, yet the music was still inside the room. A smile slowly disappeared from Carson's face. For the first time in years of hosting live television, he understood something he had never considered before. Rhythm wasn't created by instruments. It was created by people. James looked directly at Carson while his foot continued marking time. "You asked me if funk could survive without the show." He paused. "It can." Another tap echoed through the silent studio. "But people can't survive very long without rhythm." Then James nodded once. The drummer returned. The bass answered. The guitar joined. This time the horns exploded into the arrangement with a power that shook the studio walls. The audience rose to its feet almost instinctively, clapping, smiling, some dancing beside their seats, without realizing they had begun moving. But Johnny Carson didn't stand. He simply watched. His eyes had become fixed on James Brown, not as a celebrity, not as an entertainer, but as a man who had somehow transformed a television performance into something deeply human. James slowly reached into his jacket one final time and looked at the old folded note. He didn't read it. Instead, he looked across the stage at Carson. "The music was never the miracle," he said quietly. "It was what the music helped people survive." Johnny Carson lowered his head. His throat tightened. He reached for the glasses resting on his desk, pretending to adjust them. But everyone closest to the stage saw what happened next. A single tear rolled slowly down his face. And for the first time that night, nobody applauded. Nobody wanted to interrupt the silence James Brown had taught them to hear. The moment the director called for a commercial break, the glowing on-air sign above the stage went dark. For several seconds, nobody moved. The audience remained standing, but the applause that normally exploded after a musical performance never came. It wasn't because they disliked what they had witnessed. It was because they didn't know how to respond to it. The silence felt more appropriate than applause. James Brown quietly stepped away from the microphone while the orchestra remained seated, many of the musicians still staring at him with expressions that mixed admiration with disbelief. They had followed him through an arrangement that had never been rehearsed, trusting every movement of his foot more than any sheet of music lying in front of them. Johnny Carson slowly walked out from behind his desk. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Carson looked at James and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I thought I was challenging your music," he admitted softly. James shook his head. "No. You were challenging your understanding of it." Carson lowered his eyes. "I've interviewed hundreds of performers." He paused before continuing. "But tonight was the first time someone answered a question I didn't know I was asking." James reached into his jacket and removed the worn envelope one last time. Without saying a word, he placed it gently on Carson's desk. Carson looked down at it. "I can't take this." James smiled. "It isn't for keeping. It's for remembering." Carson carefully unfolded the old paper again. This time, he noticed something written on the opposite side, words James himself had added years after receiving the original message. "When people finally listen, don't make them feel guilty for misunderstanding you. Make them grateful they finally heard you." Carson read the sentence twice. Then he looked back at James. "You could have embarrassed me tonight." James smiled gently. "Embarrassing someone changes their pride." He buttoned his jacket. understanding changes their heart. For the first time that evening, Johnny Carson had no clever response. He simply stood there, holding the note in his hands, realizing that the greatest performance of the night hadn't changed his opinion of James Brown. It had quietly changed something inside himself. Years later, people who had been inside NBC Studio One that night rarely described the performance the same way. Some remembered the silence before the first note. Some remembered Johnny Carson wiping away a tear he never tried to explain. Others remembered the old envelope that seemed to carry a lifetime inside a single folded sheet of paper. But almost everyone remembered leaving the studio with the strange feeling that they had witnessed something much bigger than a television performance. Johnny Carson continued interviewing legendary musicians for many years, yet those closest to him noticed a quiet change. Whenever a guest spoke about music, Carson became less interested in asking about record sales, awards, or fame. Instead, he began asking a different question. What made you keep going when nobody was listening? It wasn't a question about success. It was a question about survival. James Brown never publicly spoke in detail about that evening. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been shared with everyone willing to hear it. The greatest artists don't create unforgettable moments because they possess extraordinary talent. They create them because they transform ordinary pain into something other people can recognize inside themselves. That was the real rhythm James Brown carried onto Carson's stage. Not one measured by drums, not one written on sheet music, but one built from perseverance, hope, and the refusal to stop moving forward when life tried to steal the beat. Perhaps that's why the performance has lived on in the hearts of those who remember it. Not because Johnny Carson challenged the King of Funk, but because, for one unforgettable night, a simple television question became a reminder that the strongest rhythm any person can carry isn't found in music. It's found in the courage to keep time, even when life falls silent. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What song has helped you through the hardest season of your life?